Yes, okay, awesome. Thank you so much for coming and thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate that. Yes, my name is Lorelei Roos. I am the chair of the City of Guelph's Accessibility Advisory Committee. We are a group of majority disabled individuals who advise the mayor and council on matters pertaining to accessibility in our city. However, it is really important for me to note that I'm not here on behalf of them at all today. We have at the AAC been having discussions around this topic a lot recently, and I'm really excited if anybody would like me to point them in the direction of any of our recorded meetings or the motions that we've been passing, and those are kind of the official opinions of the AAC, and I can't speak on behalf of those folks today. I'm here speaking on behalf of my own experiences working in the community and just some of my own opinions as an individual citizen of Guelph. So, yes, I do work on the AAC. I'm also on the board of directors for the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies, Eviance, Guelph Independent Living. I work with Kids Ability Guelph. So I do a lot of, I'm on a lot of boards and committees in kind of an accessibility advisory capacity. I've lived in Guelph my whole life, so you may have seen me bopping around town in my hot pink wheelchair, or walking, which I like to mention because sometimes people are really confused by that. They'll see me do a talk, and then they'll see me out in town walking around unassisted or in my wheelchair, and they'll be like, oh no, what happened? So that's just the type of disability I have. It depends from day to day whether I'm able to walk or not. But yeah, I have done a lot of advocacy and kind of outreach work in the disabled community as well. And there's always been a lot of overlap between the disabled and the unhoused communities, but in recent years, my disability advocacy work has brought me much more steadily into the unhoused community. So I'm now doing a lot of work in the encampments, volunteering, doing kind of community support stuff, working with your downtown Guelph friends. And that's no surprise, really, that my work has been bringing me more into the unhoused community when we consider the fact that in the past 2 years alone, the people who are on ODSP and OW who are unhoused has actually doubled in only 2 years, almost doubled. In 2022, there were 14,500 people who were on OW or ODSP and were unhoused, and just this last July, that number was sitting at over 26,500 people.
That's in Ontario?
In Ontario, those are provincial stats. So, sorry, my glasses are clogging up. So I'm sure that that number has only risen since then because that was in July. I've kind of watched in horror as the Venn diagram of people experiencing homelessness and people experiencing disability is starting to just look like a circle. It's really been hard to watch. And Venn diagrams are kind of a good place for me to start talking today, because I actually want to speak to you about the fact that the further my work has taken me into advocating for the rights of the unhoused, the more often those requests for help are being met with like charts or budgets or percentages, usually in an effort to explain to me why the problem is not as bad as I think it is. I hear things like, well, don't worry, there are still 20 empty shelter beds right now in Guelph, so it can't be that big a problem. Oh, I think there's only like 75 homeless people in Guelph, so it can't be that big a problem. But people are not numbers, and so numbers cannot actually solve this problem. And the numbers that we're hearing are not always reflective of the reality of life and the situation that we're living in. Sorry, lost my place entirely. Yes, numbers are not always reflective of the reality of the situation we're living in. And numbers, because they don't reflect the actual human experience of the people that they are representing, we can't rely on them entirely to solve this problem. I want to expand a bit on what I mean when I say that the numbers aren't reflective of the reality of the situation. One way that this has come up a lot recently is in discussions about evicting homeless people from certain areas in Guelph. When I've been advocating against that and advocating instead for more supportive solutions, one of the things I've been hearing a lot, even from our own mayor, is, but there are enough shelter beds available. Like I saw on this staff report that there are enough shelter beds. But are there? Like, are there enough shelter beds when there are more people who are unhoused in Guelph on the by name list than there are total shelter beds in all of Guelph? And not all unhoused people are even on the by name list. Are there enough shelter beds when I'm volunteering downtown and people break down in tears in front of me and say that they've been turned away from all the shelters and they're scared and they don't know what to do? Are the shelter beds available enough when a man who's had a dog who's his best friend for 10 years is being told to surrender that dog to the Humane Society for somebody else to adopt if he wants to sleep in a shelter? Are there enough shelter beds when we consider the fact that the shelter beds that we're seeing that are empty on these information reports, they often include beds at women-only and youth-only shelters, and not everybody qualifies for those beds? Are the shelter beds that are available enough when there are limits to how many personal belongings someone's allowed to bring into a shelter? And when someone has so little, is it fair of us to ask them to strip that down to less in exchange for a place to sleep? Are there enough shelter beds when the available beds aren't accessible to people with disabilities? Are there really enough shelter beds when I've heard from multiple community members that staying in a shelter means sleeping on a cot in a room next to the room that their abuser sleeps in, rather than in a community of people they've chosen and feel safe around? Are there enough shelter beds? I'm sorry, there's a lot here, but are there enough shelter beds when someone who's in crisis can have a disagreement with staff in a shelter and be banned from that shelter or even blacklisted from other shelters? Are there enough shelters when people with substance use disorders who absolutely deserve somewhere to stay are often kicked out of shelters for using substances? And are there enough shelter beds if the notwithstanding clause is not required in order to evict encampment residents if there are enough shelters? And yet the mayor of our city and these other mayors who've signed this letter seem to think that it's absolutely necessary right now. So are there enough shelter beds? Is the shelter sufficient? I think if we actually look at this situation and examine this problem off the paper, we can see that there are not enough shelter beds. Certainly not enough for us to be going around telling people that they shouldn't be sleeping in tents. But if all we do is look at a chart that says there's 20 empty beds right now and there were 18 empty beds last week, we may be misled into believing that the problem has been solved, when that's far from the reality. There are a lot of reasons that those beds are empty, and there are a lot of reasons that there are still hundreds of people living in encampments in Guelph, and even more people who are unhoused in Guelph. Pointing to empty beds on a piece of paper doesn't change or fix that. So perhaps we need to stop looking at information reports that say how many empty beds there are, and start instead asking ourselves why those beds are empty. Another example of this type of thinking, when we can kind of conflate human beings and numbers as being the same thing, is when we talk about evicting encampment residents from areas like downtown, like with Guelph's recent public space use bylaw, or other bylaws like it in neighboring municipalities. People who defend this type of legislation will say things like, well, all we're asking is that people not camp in these specific places. There are plenty of other places that you can go in Guelph and set up a tent. But once again, from all of the experiences I'm hearing, I have to ask, are there? One reason that asking people to move somewhere else isn't a good enough solution is that this bylaw, and many others like it, don't take into account the experiences of individuals who are disabled and unhoused. And there are a lot of disabled people in the unhoused community. Many of the permissible locations are inaccessible. In fact, I say they are all inaccessible because the bylaw actually explicitly states that there can be no encampments within 10 meters of any accessible pathways, sidewalks, trails, walkways, or paths. So how is a person who uses a wheelchair supposed to get to their tent? It specifically uses the language accessible pathways. Why are unhoused disabled people being told, oh, no, sorry, accessibility isn't for you. You have to stay 10 meters away from it. I can't cross 10 meters of grass or rocky terrain when I'm in my wheelchair. And what about blind and low vision folks who are trying to find their way to an encampment with no accessible pathway to get close? It's not as if the city is saying don't block access to accessible pathways. They're saying stay 10 meters away from accessibility. It makes me really upset. meant to be for all of us who live in this city, not just the people who live here in houses, and not just the people with the financial means to donate to people's political campaigns. Honestly, there are other accessibility needs that are overlooked with bylaws like these. I spoke to one woman who lived in the downtown encampment and has a seizure disorder, and she was really afraid of being split up into smaller groups because she said she didn't know if she had a seizure if anyone would find her. I've spoken to folks who use mobility equipment that were using the raised flower beds downtown to transfer in and out of their wheelchairs. One gentleman who used the raised flower beds to stand up on days when his arthritis was particularly bad. He's like, I can't climb onto the ground to get into my bed. There are also low vision folks who struggle to find their way in the low lighting of many of the permissible encampment zones. Substance use disorders are illnesses just like any other and are absolutely deserving of accessibility accommodations. And for those folks, accessibility may look like being in close proximity to supports, like consumption sites or the CHC, or welcoming streets, downtown overdose prevention. Honestly, I could sit here all day listing disabilities and I still wouldn't cover every barrier that folks living in encampments might face, especially considering that shelter insecurity does impact disabled people at such disproportionately high rates. Disability spans a broad spectrum of experiences, so there are a lot of reasons that it's important to give people autonomy to decide where to set up their homes. These solutions that exist on paper and try to fit everyone into the same box don't take into account experiences of people like me. I've looked over this bylaw a lot and I couldn't find a single place that it would be legal for someone like me to set up an encampment and live. So sure, on paper it may look like there are other places to go, but I wonder how many people who support this bylaw actually sat and tried to figure out where people could camp. Because I was downtown volunteering to help out packing people's things on eviction day. And there were tons of questions from people who were not sure where they were going to be allowed to camp. And I didn't know what to tell them. Even some bylaw officers were like, we don't know where you can go. So that's really confusing and difficult. So when people say there are other places that these people can go, the reality is that for a lot of people, there kind of aren't. And it's not just disability that puts people in that situation. I spoke to one encampment resident who said that there was a community of women who'd been camping all together that was really afraid of being split up. They rely on each other for safety, and most of the time that's actually safety from people who live in houses and don't want the tents in our community and will harass or attack these people. What she said to me was that the city keeps talking about dignity and safety, but splitting us up into little groups isn't how you keep people safe. That's how you hunt deer. Splitting people up into small groups and dispersing them throughout the city is unsafe and inhumane. I also heard from residents that being forced to move away from downtown supports like food and medical care and substance use supports is even more difficult because then in order to come seek out those supports, people are having to decide whether to risk leaving everything they own out in the open for hours at a time. And in that amount of time, things can get stolen. People who don't want tents in their neighborhood can tear those tents down or vandalize them. If you had to leave all of your belongings out on your front lawn every time you had to run errands, would you feel safe going out for food? What if your neighbors didn't want you living there and you knew that? Would you feel safe leaving your things out in the open? I spoke to a gentleman literally 2 days ago who said that before the evictions, he was feeling really confident about his journey towards sobriety. And that now he's not sure what's gonna happen. He said, I can take a bus downtown, I guess, to pick up the prescriptions that support me in this sobriety journey. But it's a long bus ride, and I have to leave my stuff for a really long time. And people who have drugs are gonna come to my camp. So I don't know what's gonna happen. And I think we can all agree that that is a horrible situation for us to put people in. So what do? I don't have all the answers, but I have a few ideas of where we could maybe start. I think we really need to realize that human beings aren't numbers on a piece of paper, so the solutions that we bring forward can't just be numbers on a piece of paper. I don't want to hear any more information reports about how many empty shelter beds there are. We need to really focus on pulling these solutions off the paper and looking at them in the real world to determine whether or not they are actually solutions. That can look like going out and engaging with community members who are living in tents or encampments, asking them what works for them, finding out why they aren't using the supports that are in place, and then going back and adjusting those supports to better meet people's needs. It can look like listening to the advice of equity-seeking groups, because any intersectionality of kind of marginalized experiences is going to really heavily impact people who are unhoused. And I'm not just talking about listening to the AAC or listening to the disabled community. We need to listen to the trans community, the Black community, the Indigenous community, because their experiences are different than other folks' experiences. We also need to listen to the advice of healthcare professionals when they tell us not to get rid of vital healthcare supports, like safe consumption sites, safe needle exchange programs, drug supply testing programs, and we need to listen to those same professionals when they tell us that things like involuntary treatment will do more harm to our community than good, when they tell us that there's a really high risk of fatal overdose upon discharge from those types of programs, and when they tell us that instead we need to be focusing on supportive solutions that are voluntary and affordable and make them easier to access for people. In general, I think we need to start listening to healthcare professionals a lot more than we listen to politicians about our healthcare options and our health treatment. I'm going wildly off script here for a second, but the mayor of our city sold homeowners insurance before he was our mayor. I don't think that's a bad career at all. Good for you, that's a perfectly respectable job. I'm not trying to say that it's not. But it certainly doesn't make someone qualified to talk about other people's treatment, especially not involuntary treatment, especially not against the advice of healthcare professionals. And yet we hear him and the premier and other politicians constantly chiming in with opinions that are contrary to the opinions of doctors and therapists and social workers and researchers and substance use disorder specialists. To me, that doesn't make sense. I kind of feel like if you want to play doctor, you should maybe either be a doctor or I don't know, there's probably a DLC for The Sims you could download or something, but it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to get back on script though, because I'm rambling and I just have a little bit left here, and I don't want to get in trouble. You guys all heard me say I'm not here on behalf of the AAC, right? These are my opinions. But yeah, we desperately need solutions that are supportive, voluntary, backed by research, and that respects the autonomy of the individuals that we're looking to support. Solutions like tiny home communities, more variety of shelter options for people, more accessible shelter options for disabled people. We need more actually affordable housing, not market affordable, but literally can low-income people afford these houses type of housing. We need more opportunities to eat for people who are experiencing food insecurity. We need to tackle issues of lack of income, lack of access to healthcare supports, and we need to stop attempting to override people's charter rights or leaning on the arm of the law to push people out of our field of view so that we can pretend that they just don't exist and get back to our holiday shopping. I invite you all to join me in reminding our policymakers of these realities, because we're seeing the devastation that poor policy can cause to a community. We've lost, I think 6 community members in the past 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Yes. And the woman that I quoted, I didn't know whether to mention this because I don't want to politicize her death by any means, but the woman that I quoted speaking about hunting deer, her name was Jen, and she's not here anymore. There's a memorial downtown for her if you go to St. George's Square. And I worry that this is going to get only worse if we continue down the path that we're on. So let's stop relying on numbers to tell a story that only human beings can truly tell. Sorry. So let's stop relying on numbers to tell this story that only human beings can truly tell. Because we can do better. We owe it to one another to do better. Thank you very much for listening to me. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.